This is K.M. Wyland, and you are listening to the 200th episode of the Wordplay Podcast. The big news this week was that I reached the quarter mark in my historical fantasy work in progress, Storming. I think this is the fastest quarter of a book I've ever written, especially considering that it's a chubby 30,000 words right now. I always stop every quarter to read back over what I've already written. Doing so helps me streamline the editing process later on, but its biggest benefit is simply keeping me oriented in the flow of my story. It's so easy to get lost in the day-to-day minutiae of the storytelling that I can sometimes forget the big picture. I've read about halfway through this edit, and so far I'm really pleased with how the story is rolling along. So far, it's the easiest story I've ever read. As you can probably tell, I'm having a ball with it. Are your multiple POVs killing your story's suspense? The latest post in the video series on my blog cautions against sharing too much information with readers at the expense of their investment in the protagonist. To watch it, visit my website at www.helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. New videos are posted every Wednesday. And now, I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. What if your story's antagonist isn't a person? Good fiction is overflowing with excellent antagonists. In some instances, those antagonists end up being just as memorable, if not more so, than the protagonists they oppose. Hannibal Lecter, Darth Vader, Agent Smith. But what if your story doesn't have a human antagonist? I like to refer to the story's opposing faction as the antagonistic force, since it takes the emphasis off the antagonist's humanity. Nowhere is it written that your story has to have a bad guy, or girl, as the case may be. The obstacle that stands between your character and his overall story goal could be any number of non-human manifestations. Let's consider a few. Man versus animal. This one is a favorite of a certain class of horror movies. King Kong, Godzilla, Jurassic Park, Jaws, The Ghost in the Darkness, Night of the Lepus. Man versus self. Here we have the age-old existential quandary of man as his own worst enemy. Most stories feature this antagonistic force on some level, since the hero often has to overcome his own problems before he'll gain the tools to defeat the external antagonist. But we also see it in play as the primary antagonistic force in stories such as David Guterson's East of the Mountains, Ridley Scott's A Good Year, and Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. Man versus setting. Survival stories often include a gamut of antagonists, but the most important one is always the setting. Whether the character is dealing with the wilderness or the urban jungle, his first concern is always surviving his surroundings. Good examples include Castaway, Snowwalker, The Towering Inferno, and The Road. Man versus society. Man vs. Society is a lot like Man vs. Setting, with the addition of an oppressive societal structure. These stories usually take place in an urban environment, which can either be primarily comfortable, as would usually be the case in a modern setting, or primarily uncomfortable, as in an apocalyptic setting. What's important in these stories is that the authority structures are oppressive, or perceived as such, by the protagonist, such as we find in The Invisible Man, Equilibrium, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and The Hunger Games. Man versus supernatural. Sometimes your protagonist will find himself bucking fate or even God himself. These stories are rarely about the defeat of the supernatural antagonist, but rather about the hero himself coming to grips with certain truths and learning to surrender to them. Karen Hancock's Light of Iden is ultimately a story of this, as is Here Comes Mr. Jordan, Meet Joe Black, and The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. Man versus technology. Many sci-fi stories use overarching technological antagonistic forces to oppose their heroes. These can be faceless computers, such as Wargames Whopper, or constructs personified into distinct characters in their own right, such as in the Terminator movies. And then, of course, there's the flip side of all this, in which the technology is the hero and the humans are the antagonists, such as in AI, artificial intelligence. Man versus weather. In many ways, this is an offshoot of man versus setting. Via horrendous weather conditions, an otherwise ordinary setting becomes an antagonistic force that threatens the character's life or the completion of some specific goal. The perfect storm, white squall, Armageddon, a rain of asteroids is weather, right? And the day after tomorrow are all good examples. You don't have to limit yourself to human antagonists. You don't even have to limit yourself to just one type of antagonistic force within your story. Most stories will use a combination of several of these options to oppose the hero throughout the plot arc, even though one specific type of antagonist will usually rise to the fore as your primary villain. So, have fun playing around with the options. Thank you for listening to the Wordplay Podcast. To read a transcript of this episode, you can visit my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And be sure to check back again next week.